Good morning and most welcome to 1436. It is an absolutely gorgeous sky we have today. Azure blue, and it's glistering in the snow. I don't know how cold it is, but it must be like 4 or 5 minus, I imagine. Very beautiful day. And a beautiful day with a beautiful start. We will look into the writings of Hans Rehn, Swedish philosopher and Derrida Heidegger interpreter, as I think. And this is from chapter 5 of...
Yes, a book published in 2013.
Called?
It's called, let me see. The title is Paul in the Grip of the Philosophers. Paul in the Grip of the Philosophers. Call on Apostle and Contemporary Continental Philosophy. Paul in the Grip of the Philosophers, Apostle and Contemporary Continental Philosophy.
Okay, thank you very much. I start with chapter 5 and it's page 71. Circumcising the word. Derrida as reader of Paul. And we hadn't finished with Saint Paul from Jacques Derrida Weil. Introduction. In the year 1967, 3 books were published in Paris by 3 different publishing houses, but by the same author, Jacques Derrida, a French philosopher of Algerian Jewish descent. Who was then in his mid-30s. One of the books was a critical analysis of the problem of meaning and language in relation to time in the work of Husserl, with the title Speech and Phenomena. Another was a collection of essays devoted to a number of different thinkers, notably Hegel, Freud, Foucault, Lévi-Strauss, entitled Writing and Difference. The third book also consisted of a few essays, the longest of which treated Rousseau and the problem of the origin of language. But it was presented under one general heading, as grammatology. Throughout the different themes and writers treated in the books, the texts were united by a common critical approach that consisted in locating and cleverly undermining the different ways in which the analyzed texts sought to secure their own theoretical position by reference to an origin, a system, or stable method. I'd say this is very pertinent here. We mentioned just in the previous lecture about what I called origin there. It's connected in Wittgenstein to private language. In the place of the full and final signifier, Derrida posited an original difference or difference. As a trace of what had always already taken place. Let me repeat. As a trace of what had always already taken place. Already is very, very, it's crucial. Not to think of the past only. Throughout the analysis, the theoretical hubris of structuralism was questioned from the position of a Nietzschean spirit of play and transgression. It was the birth of post-structuralism. But also of Derrida as a public intellectual with an approach that would henceforth always be associated with his name, deconstruction. In more restricted philosophical circles, Derrida had already made a name for himself as a prodigious young critical phenomenologist. Five years earlier, he had published a translation of a late text by Husserl, The Origin of Geometry, accompanied by an almost 200-page long preface. The text amounted to a full-scale survey of the whole project of phenomenology, with a critical edge. Centered on the impossibility of maintaining and accessing an atemporal meaning. in retrospect, one can detect already in this early book the main premises for the deconstructive critique, not only of Husserl, but of philosophy at large. Still, at this stage, there was no declaration of an alternative method. It was only following the publication of grammatology and the parallel deconstructive readings in 1967 that it became clear that here was a thinker who had somehow also taken French phenomenology to another level by questioning the very foundations on which its beliefs in a philosophy of meaning and consciousness rested. And takeaway from this sentence is the parallel reading. You're reading two different texts simultaneously, and I would say that is the very seed of deconstruction. This was done not in the form of a full rejection of its basic premises, but rather as a radicalization using the phenomenological analysis of temporality itself to undermine the very possibility of a stable presence. There's a lot of comparisons here. A stable presence could also be seen as an origin in the now, or me having a private language, saying meaningful things in the now. What more exactly? Derrida had accomplished in these works and what the method of deconstruction really consisted in, if indeed it was a method, has been a topic of debate ever since. In the decades that followed, Derrida continued to publish in a high pace. Sorry for slurping. Traveling the globe and giving lectures and courses. At the end of his life in 2004, he had published more than 50 books and numerous articles and interviews. After his death, it has also become clear how much of his work had remained unpublished, and that will eventually surface in posthumous volumes. Books on Derrida and deconstruction started appearing already in the mid-70s, and since then this literature has grown steadily. Just to summarize this whole discussion of the role and meaning of deconstruction is today a research task in itself. Here my goal is more modest, namely to try to contribute to an understanding of how Derrida and his work can and should be related to the contemporary philosophical interest in St. Paul. At first glance, task this ambition. I think there is a spelling error here. At first glance, this ambition, it should be, may appear misplaced for the simple reason that Derrida never wrote about Paul. Among the many classical, philosophical, literary and theological writers to which he devoted careful deconstructive analysis, to Heidegger, Celan, Freud, Kafka, Joyce, Husserl, etc. He never devoted a single text specifically to the writings of St. Paul. when he refers to Paul, which he does on a few occasions, it is mostly in passing and often with a critical edge. Yet in one of his late essays, Paul does emerge as the focus of his interest. If only over a few pages, in the context of analyzing the multi-layered phenomenon of the veil. It is here that he states the words recalled in the motto above. We hadn't finished. I haven't finished with St. Paul. In order to make sense of the constellation Derrida and Paul, we have to entangle carefully the implications of this statement. We have to learn how to trace how what we could call the Pauline problem, or indeed Pauline problems, including the problem of Paul himself and his following. Does indeed reverberate throughout Derrida's writings in more ways than first meets the eye. In order to do this, we need to follow a series of Pauline themes or tropes and how they travel through Derrida's work. And also how they are transformed and refigured in the course of this journey. To these themes belongs that of circumcision. But also of justice and hope. As well as of the very idea of deconstruction as an intellectual strategy. But they also include the question of universalism, cosmopolitanism, and to the relation between Jewish and Greek spirituality, and ultimately the spirit as such. It is my hope to show that as we perform this in part experimental reading of Paul in Derrida, we can see how Derrida and deconstruction is not only a theory that is potentially applicable to Paul and his epistles, but also how the very project of deconstruction can be seen as to some extent part of Pauline intellectual legacy. The meaning of not having finished with Paul then also comprises not just continuing to deal with Paul, but also continuing to critically explore and confront him and his inheritance. And I would do some parallel reading of myself here and see how the two texts syncs together or disconsorts together. I would read a paragraph from Paul Johnston, Rethinking the Inner, Wittgenstein. And for you who followed the last lecture, I will continue where I left off. And we were discussing the inner as, I would say, think also of an origin or initial cause. In quantum physics, it's initial conditions that are looked for in the same way. So it's the last paragraph on page 27. This approach to the inner involves a completely new way of understanding our psychological concepts. It also involves rejecting the confusing picture which treats the inner as though it were a substance whose changes, states, and motions the individual observes and reports on. And you can compare that to the deconstruction of consciousness, as was mentioned in Ruin's text. We are also talking about res cogitans, a sort of liquidy, flowing thing somewhere at this side of me, not out there. And it's sort of motions individual observes and reports on. In contrast, Wittgenstein's approach emphasizes that what interests us is the attitudes and behavior of human being. And is in the example by my dear colleague in the previous lecture, Jesus did actually help the leopard. That is the important. The pain behavior of others, for example, matters to us, and it is on this basis that the language game is built up, not on internality, not on origins, not on original presence. My comments, the last three. What happens is that the individual reacts in a certain way. For instance, cries after falling over. And we teach her to use a linguistic expression. We call the words she then uses sensation words because of the type of basis they have and because of their role in the language game. And this is of course very close to the deconstruction of Saussure, where the signified usually is more important because it's out there in the world, whereas the signifier is pushed into the background. Here it's both at the same time, and that it is those things that matters. They have the effect, not consciousness. Let me take a little pause there. So for the first summary here, Hans Rien writes very eloquently and condensed that he undermines, speaking of Derrida, the different way in which an analyzed text sought to secure their own theoretical position by reference to an origin, a system, a stable method. And here comes the important. This is very seldom understood, obviously understood by Hans Reen. It's a difficult point to make in a short sentence. And as we mentioned before, Derrida posited an original difference as a trace of what had always already taken place. In the beginning, it said that deconstruction is also a criticism of consciousness. Think of it like this signified signifier. The signifier could also be called intention, and it has connections to consciousness. It's an inner thing. What we intend with a signifier is coming from within, whereas the signified is out there. It's an outer thing. This is looked into by Derrida. He discovers that in reality there is an original difference rather, not a stable origin for meaning. The inside is not a reservoir of meanings, a fluid liquid system that sort of moves in the inside and produces meanings, intentions, signifiers. I parallel this to the text by Paul Johnston, Wittgenstein Rethinking the Inner. And in his text, it's the, as I call my term, causative inner original that gives the pain signifier that we can read. It's supposed to be a signified, but this time inside, not outside. So that ouch means pain. So you see here, they are very, very like in a parallel twist of looking at what could be given many different terms. And they are also opening up to a parallel reading of the kind that Derrida himself did so many times. This is also comparable to physics of initial conditions. What are the initial conditions? Listen now carefully. They are unknown. All physicists agree on that. They are causative of the system that we can see, the outside, the classical laws, or cosmos, which we can see. it is implying the Derridian consciousness, this specific sense of consciousness. Something that is unknown, even, I would say, at the very outset, supposed to be unknowable. This fits also with the Cartesian res cogitans and extens res extensa. Everything about the res extensa can be known as the classical laws in physics, or as what is signified. Nothing of res cogitans can be known. It's a big blur, a blob, something we cannot penetrate into. Derrida meant that this causes a blindness or a darkness in the text, in the thinking. He enters the text and he heals it. He opens it up. The covering which this does in the Saussurean take is unveiled. The cover comes off. Both Wittgenstein and Derrida are extremely careful in their writing. Every word is put on a very precision scale. And I think that is also the reason one has to be extremely careful when reading Derrida. Extremely. If you confuse any level or any understanding is not absolutely clear, and then go to the next level, understanding, I think, will be lost. And you will not truly understand. In the case of Wittgenstein, he wants to help us to understand the world, ourselves. And I would say, my comment, to understand, oddly enough, there is an inner world to be discovered. Something to learn from, something that can be unveiled, put into understanding, because this is a covering up. It is adding ignorance. One is always, as using the thinking of Derrida, it's lower, hierarchically marginalized, while the other one is the one that is having presence, light on it, and of course the truer of the two. Since the other one disappears, also understanding disappears. Knowledge goes out. this is the specific use of the word consciousness in this text, I would say. Most specific, don't confuse it with the generalized idea of I perceive something. It has a specific, important use in this scenario. Maybe coming from my dear colleague here, careful with the slowly.
Thank you again, Hans. And let me return to the example of Mark chapter 27. Let me reiterate the position. So we have a leper coming to Jesus, and Jesus feels compassion for the leper and he heals him. But there is one manuscript that says that he doesn't feel compassion, but he becomes angry at this leper. And textual critics, scholars, New Testament scholars, they are divided. What is the right reading? Did he become angry or did he feel compassion? And there is the leading New Testament scholar today, the absolutely number one today, is Bart Ehrman. And he says that in his youth he was a fervent Christian, but then he came to New Testament and he saw that the manuscripts disagree, and this was one of the passages that made him to distance him from Christianity, because he says that if the manuscripts don't agree, then we don't know what God intended. But I would say that actually we have an answer from Wittgenstein. What Ehrman does, he falls into the trap of private language. So what is the, so let's say that I have pain. It could be, let's say it's in the stomach. I feel in my stomach. But then I go to a doctor, he says that the pain is caused by my neck. So who is right? That I who pointed at my stomach or the doctor? Wittgenstein would say both are right. And there is not the origin, would be perhaps, the origin of the pain could be neck. But for Wittgenstein, it doesn't matter, it's not the point. The origin is not the point. But is the, both are right. That is the point. And then, and I would like to repeat one phrase that you read here earlier from page 27 from Johnston's Wittgenstein book. It also involves rejecting the confusing picture which there is the inner, as though it were a substance whose changes, states, emotions the individual observes and reports on. In contrast, Wittgenstein's approach emphasizes that what interests us is attitudes and behavior of human beings. That is, the point is that Jesus heals the leper. That is the main point. And what is his, so to say, Jesus' inner feelings? They are like in the example from Johnston and Wittgenstein. Pain. We can be almost certain that Jesus felt pain, and then he also was compassionate and angry for some reason or other. And who are the doctors in this case? Now, or the doctor, I would say there are two doctors. We could say one doctor says that he was angry, the other says that he felt compassionate. But the true reason is, okay, the arche in different terms, it is that is the pre-arche perhaps. It was pain. Pain gives birth to anger and compassion. So the point is that there's a private language trap that Ehrman does. That treating the inner as though it were a substance of changes, says emotions, the inward observes and reports on. But it's the attitude and behavior of human things that is important, namely that Jesus takes action. And let me give it back to you, Hans.
Careful hand.
Excellent, fantastic.
Yes.
Important in the end is what actually happens. He did heal the leper. That's the important. And I do recognize the private language trap. I fell into it once upon a time as well. It is underneath the surface in all our culture, and it's very, very hard to pinpoint. You have to be excellently careful. I think you succeeded there, Kalle. It is spot on. This Berman is looking for an inner truth, and sadly enough, and that was the case for me as well, I would never be able to find that truth out. But it was enough for him to reject on that only basis. A very good example. Thank you. And we could put a pause there.
So we continue with the lecture, and we're still having sunshine here. And I will read a little further from Hans Ruin, where I left off the second paragraph on page 73. The literature on Derrida and Paul is scant, with one significant exception: Theodore Jennings' monograph, Reading Derrida, Thinking Paul, from 2006. The basic idea of this study is to explore and to show how Derrida's thinking, in particular on justice and cosmopolitanism, can be used as an interpretive background for a contemporary reading of Paul. In a laudable effort to free Paul from what he calls the confessional ecclesiastical ghetto, tough word, of doctrinal interest, Jennings wants to show how Paul's discussion of justice and righteousness, especially in Romans, contains a message of immediate relevance for our contemporary political philosophical situation. By performing such a reading, he also wants to liberate Paul from the accusations
of being the originator of Christian anti-Semitism. As suggested by Levinas and others. Jennings' approach is not based on an argument about any direct textual relation between Paul and Derrida. He has a good summary of most of the different passages in Derrida's work, where he explicitly mentions Paul. But these remarks are at the same time said to be mostly blind alleys. The study is a useful source book for exploring the relation between Paul and Derrida. And its summary of Derrida's way of thinking about justice, cosmopolitanism, and messianism does a favor to Christian theology by opening up new, more liberal and liberating ways of relating to central tenets of the Pauline message. But as an argument about the inner philosophical relation and dialectics between Paul's letters and Derrida's work, it does not contribute much.
even though Derrida's references to Paul are scant, they carry more philosophical weight than what is recognized by Jennings. The relation between the writings is more profound, complex, and potentially controversial, both for contemporary theology and political philosophy. Ultimately, Jennings is too committed to saving Paul. As when he refers approvingly to an interview with Derrida from the mid-80s, where the latter recognizes the use that was already then being made among theologians of deconstruction, not against their faith, but in service of their faith. Amongst others, my comment here is referred, of course, to negative theology. End of comment. My argument here will take a different path, as I will try to show how we can read Derrida as implicitly thinking in the wake of a Pauline legacy. But also how he should be seen as an important contemporary critic of how this legacy is cultivated in the present, not least by some of Paul's more ingenious philosophical readers. Well, there is an odd parallel here. Jennings is trying to save Paul. And I thought about that theologian mentioned previously, Berman. Well, there's a lot of people struggling with this. I would say there are millions out there suffering from this, so to speak, misunderstanding. It's a misunderstanding that is so light that light milk is not light enough, so to speak. It is at first recognition nothing. It's a sheer nothing, an uninteresting declaration, like me saying, this is a piece of glass. This is how it should strike you. There is initially nothing interesting in this, but once you manage to keep your vision clear, and once you're starting to understand,
it is incredibly big. And I often think of how the uninteresting piece of glass can make all these colors that I can see. I don't know if they come through on the video, but there is a lot of colors going on here. So see Derrida and Wittgenstein, I wouldn't call them ideological philosophers like Kant or Hegel that establishes something, but rather as prisms that makes everything shine much stronger. And you do not have to give up anything of your understanding or your thinking. Because what they actually are doing is revealing a deficit in your thinking. And therein lies the glory. I think we take a pause here. I hope. And I will continue with Wittgenstein Rethinking the Inner by Paul Johnston. And I was in the second paragraph of page 27, still talking about pain behavior. Primitive pain behavior is a sensation behavior. It gets replaced by a linguistic expression. The word pain is the name of a sensation. Is equivalent to I've got a pain, is an expression. Wittgenstein's emphasis on behavior should not, however, be seen as a form of behaviorism, which is almost always the interpretation. On the contrary, the concept of the inner expresses the distinctive nature of our interests in human beings. On the contrary, listen to this, the concept of the inner expresses the distinctive nature of our interest in human beings. It doesn't shut the inner out, it opens it up. It becomes an area for understanding. No longer shut out of view, no longer an unexplainable res cogitans. A veil. This is opening the veil, unveiling. I'm pretty sure that this is also what Heidegger is referring to. Dasein is the true inner. And the Seinsfrage is opening up Dasein, that inner. And not to put it under the microscope or the light. No. But to enter into it through Sorge, caring. When doing philosophy, I continue a bit further down, however, we misinterpret the picture and are left struggling with a confused idea. That what is essential to pain is a mysterious and private inner event. Against this, Wittgenstein urges us to recognize that we are interested in people's utterances, not as reports on mysterious occurrences, about which we are for some reason curious. We are interested in them not because they are accurate reports on inner processes, but because they are what the individuals are inclined to say. This resonate with the saying of Ian McGilchrist, the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere would think that it is an inner experience the expression is about, and not caring about the expression or the person. He will literally be like a doctor or a chemist or a physicist. Looking for an original cause and not being together with the person, caring, interacting. And McGilchrist points to that. If this is taken a bit further, it will end up with schizophrenia or autism. Those autistic people are unable to read the signs, so to speak. We had this in a lecture about 300-400 ago. They cannot see movements. The movements are the signs. they look only for the inner. And thereby misses out. In some ways, the soul is just in front of you, not covered up. John Searle and Hilary Putnam never understood this. For them, brain in a vat is somehow the essence of inner. Then we don't even need a body. That is verging on being pathological. In connection with the slaves, the poor tribes that lacked soul, Paul Johnston puts up 4 types of signals they could produce, each with its own function and interest. The latter part of page 30. A word like pain used in connection with some part of the body, usually a hurt part. This goes with medicine for the part, anesthetics, etc. B. Depression. I expect bad work, but I don't. Something to do with his eyes if he weeps. C. Wish. Used with the names of food, etc. This goes with giving him what he wants, etc. D. Intention, with the verb of action, which I then expect. And of course there can be many, many, many more. And now to the point. The interesting feature of these signals is that none of them makes any reference to something going on inside the members of the tribe. Furthermore, our teaching of these signals leaves no scope for the suggestion that there is something in common to all the cases and experience. And I think this point is of equal importance. Furthermore, our teaching of these signals leaves no scope for suggestion that there is something in common to all cases. We are usually universalizing, and we call it experience, as sort of an empty canvas where we put things in. But all the cases here are different. They do not share the term experience in the language game properly. It's very hard to see what the word experience would do. What would it add? On the contrary, what is striking is the diversity of uses the signals have. What would happen then if we suddenly introduced the inner-outer picture? The main effect would be to obscure the differences between the signals by making all the utterances look alike. Quote here. The picture has some sort of equalizing influence. We are now to say that the man, when he gives those various signals, is simply observing various phenomena. When we treat them simply as signals, they seem to have nothing in common. I'm going to put that on the board. So let me reread once more. Furthermore, our teaching of these signals leaves no scope for suggestion that there is something in common to all cases. That is an experience. On the contrary, what is striking is the diversity of uses the signals have. And if we introduce the inner and outer, that would obscure the differences between the signals and making all the utterances look alike. Wittgenstein writes, the picture has a sort of equalizing influence. Smoothing everything out, universalizing, monetizing. It's another way of not understanding. We are now to say that the man, when he gives those various signals, is simply observing, is observing various phenomena. But when we treated them as signals, they seem to have nothing in common. So the question is, what does the picture introduce? Let us think this is the perception, maybe in the ideas of James Locke, or why not any empiricist or analytical philosopher, or people in general. This is common sense. Passively taking in the outer. The same goes with this misuse of the word experience. It makes everything look the same. And this we have mentioned before. The theoreme, the theater. Although in this case, he doesn't look at the stage, he looks inwardly. But the passivity is the same. That's why I put him on a chair. He's having an experience. For some mad reason, and I think here the illusion really shows its proper face. For some mad reason, all those things are sharing something, having the quality of being an experience. That is a misuse of language. That covers up in a similar way, but also different. It covers up by generalization, smoothing out. This is why the term equalizing is done. All of a sudden, the different signals, the language game of pain or whatever it might be, becomes less. It loses its distinctiveness. It loses its possibility of being something. This is very close to the voice of a friend from the autobiography. Once we name it, generalize it, the voice will not be telling as much. We put an etiquette on it. And it doesn't really fit the language game. In the excellent example of the tribe, it would not make any sense whatsoever to call all these things experiences. It wouldn't add anything. It would be confusing. And we don't do that in normal language. If you have pain, you just have it. And then you show signs for it. You would never ever say, I've had an experience. You say, I have pain, I suffer. And that involves so much more of please help me, comfort me, or as in the example of Jesus, heal me. It's interactive. Whereas the experience takes away the uniqueness. It takes away the place of the signal, if you like, in the language game, in reality, where it does make a change. This is very close also, I would say, to Das Man, when you have become unconscious to your own surroundings and yourself. Because this is a forgetfulness, that you have an inner sphere, just as James Locke forgets the outside when he says it can be put into 5 forms only, and they are somehow the same: color, shape, extension, you know the drill. This is also very close to Susie Froebel and Terry Marks Tarnow speaks about only fractality can transfer understanding, knowing. Calling all of them experiences, rid them of their jaggedness, their place, their authenticity. They become fake money, counterfeit. And we invent our own currency by an illicit use of the word experience, introducing an unsolvable paradox within philosophy. And actually turning us into non-feeling, non-understanding people, even towards ourselves, not seeing what I have inside as significant anymore. It is just experiences. And then, in that case, we would be starting to treat ourselves just as Descartes did, ignoring all the wonders of the inner life. It is just res cogitans. That is similar to putting everything into a box of the private language, and you will not be able to penetrate it anymore. Once you lock that box yourself. So it's an interesting parallel here between something that we discussed so many times before, the outer, the atom, classical physics, the subject in front of an object in space. Wittgenstein and Derrida is also pointing to the inner side. And now it's also easier to understand both of them. And this is the res cogitans empty consciousness. Almost scary. Descartes said his thinking was reflection of the outside, which is a rather universalized and monetized and reductive way of thinking. So you see, on this side it can give cause to reductionism, but on this side it can give cause to a sort of reductive idealism, where you just don't feel yourself anymore. Because you put the stamp, this is an experience. It's a bit like the civil servants in Kafka's The Process. They are distant to you, and they treat you not as a human being anymore, but you are just an inner, a case. And the main character can really feel that he lacks, in the end, a sense of self. I would say there is no doubt that both the character, or all the characters in the process, are left brains, left hemisphere dominant, and so also Kafka himself. Is this superficial, generalized. And in the end, it will be that even those poor slaves here in the example would actually have more interaction than we do. In this minute example, they have 4. Of course, we potentially have millions. But they have 4 signals. The cat had none. It was just experience of the inside, where experience was the important thing, having no function in the language game, being a sort of misuse, and thereby covering up his inside, making him forgetful of the why, the Seinsfrage. Got a bit serious. Kalle, maybe you have a comment?
Yes.
Thank you. And I was thinking about the Latin con, not the con like cheater, but con in Latin with. So consciousness is nothing passive. We fall too easily to the trap of seeing consciousness as this world outside, but it's about communication. Let's say this patient, I'm feeling pain I have pain here. I say that I'm feeling pain here, but I'm not communicating correctly because I'm not precising my finger. And then you have the medical doctor, who says, no, the cause of the pain is my neck or something like that. So you have a problem in perhaps private language because you are not communicating sufficiently precisely, but that's not the problem either. The thing is that we we make the mistake of thinking the doctor and the patient on the same level. Wittgenstein says both are equally important. Because my pain, what I feel here, is as important about the diagnosis. The origin is not important. But we need a third person. Carl Rovelli says entanglement is not a dance for two, but for three. Because the third person checks. Who is this third person in this case? It could be like the boss of the hospital. Is the medical doctor doing his job correctly? So you need always a third person, the outsider, who checks. And here you can understand consciousness is actually something that covers everything. Within, do I know consciousness is about knowing with, that is, somebody is checking from the outside. And gives his approval to the medical doctor and this one. So you need is the whole picture. This person's feeling of pain is as important as the formal diagnosis. And that's one of Wittgenstein's points. Did I understand it correctly?
We're running out of time here. This is what Carlo Rovelli, once you mentioned him, calls relations.
Yes.
Special use of the word relation, that is very helpful. And do not forget, relations doesn't take away individuality, it reinforces it. It reinforces the understanding, and what happens is that the inner comes to life again, and then also the outer. Well, that was a treat. Quite a lot, this lecture 1436. Thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.